if the study of language or linguistic thought is considered, one can clearly observe that two fields of activity, religion and translation, were tightly united in Baltic German world, and the literature in Estonian belonged to this world up to the middle of the 19th century, approximately. Estonian literacy, in a wide sense, advanced in its early stages as a culture of translation. And this which was to be translated was first and foremost Christianity. Neither the Estonian as a generally educated language, nor the Estonian as a potential language of science or poetry was the utmost concern of officials, but Estonian as a language of Christianity, one more language in the wide world representing Christian truth and Christian morals. So the final aim of literary activities was not so much to produce texts, but to translate the pagan language, the pagan mentality, the Estonian, into the Christian language through the medium of proper texts. Baptizing, preaching, and writing, they all were aspects of Christian translation, which did not exclude, of course, some minor purposes of writing, such as entertainment in the form of occasional poetry and so on. Specific linguistic problems were brought into the focus of attention during the Age of Reformation, which started quite early in the Baltics. And so the cult of the Word of God was assigned the leading place in Lutheran worship hierarchy, and the cult of the written Word of God accomplished it. According to Martin Luther, every Christian had to communicate with God personally while reading the Bible himself. So every man first had to read the Bible in his most understandable way, in his mother tongue. For that he needed a translation, of course. And secondly, the translations had to be made from the original language, from the original languages as well. So, not from the papal and, as Luther said, corrupted Latin. So in sum, the central idea of Lutheran translating policy was to translate from the original into the original. Unfortunately, this was not to solve, but to face even more complex problems. What was the original language of the Lutheran Bible? Hebrew or German? Luther himself could be extremely individualistic or even authoritarian when praising the unique virtues of his own Bible translation. So, giving the impression that as if this and not the Hebrew or Greek original was the absolutely final edition of the Word of God. And Lutheran pastors in the Baltics, who took the work of translating the Bible into many languages, agreed with their mentor, often willingly. In the history of Estonian Bible translation, the question of the originals was extremely actual on both linguistic sides, both at the starting point, the source language, and the finishing point, the target language of translation. Towards the end of the 17th century, when the so-called Bible conferences were held, the key issues were formulated as follows. First, shall we translate the Estonian Bible from Lutheran German or directly from the ancient languages? And secondly, shall we translate it into North or South Estonian dialect? These two being the biggest variations of the nation's tongue. At first, South Estonian and the Lutheran German seemed to become prevalent in various partial translations of the Bible. But when in 1739 the complete translation of the Bible was published, this was a translation of Hebrew and Greek texts into North Estonian. And as it was the case with the Lutheran Bible, so the Estonian Bible too became a prominent unifying factor in the forming of national standard language and the model for the literary usage. So North Estonian gradually acquired the status of the Estonian original. But this was only one facet of the original. The other was its definite linguistic basis. Where do you find this original Estonian? Who is the competent teacher of it? Luther had formulated his firm principle. I quote, "We must ask the mother in the home, the children on the street, the common person in the market about this. We must be guided by their tongue, the manner of their speech, and do our translating accordingly." So, the common people were to become the reliable linguistic source of the Bible translation. Theoretically, this idea was acknowledged by the Estonian translators. The problem was how to put it into practice. Generally speaking, their motto was, according to the teachings of Luther and the spirit of Estonian language. That is, one had to keep a balance between the religious doctrine and the logic of language. Yet this motto could be interpreted variously, of course. More stress put on either side of the formula. And if we follow the discussions among the translators and their mutual criticism, we can easily discern that exactly this question was permanently the burning one. What is the real spirit of Estonian language? Which is the right usage among the people? Everybody, of course, was the best expert himself. And we can see today that the spirit of German was quite often mistaken for the genuine Estonian. But let it be as it was. I would like to stress that the issue itself, the living language of common people, was a criterion indeed for judging the rightness of language, even if it was used falsely. The translators of the Bible didn't complain about the Estonian and its linguistic qualities in general, about its presumable roughness or poverty. In any case, that was not a crucial problem. The translation work had to be done, and one had to take the target language as it was. The adequate expression was to be found among people. Johannes Gutslav, the first man to translate parts of the Old Testament into South Estonian in the 1640s and 50s, says in his essay on Estonian grammar that he describes Estonian in such a way as it is spoken in the surrounding countryside and as it must be written as well when translating the Bible. In general, for the Bible translators, the language was located on the same level as they themselves, as language users, were situated. Language was an equal, mostly a faithful, a trustworthy partner to cooperate with in translating the Bible. Sometimes, as was the case of Eberhard Gutslav Jr., 1732, all the languages, Estonian included, were interpreted as the creative works of God, and therefore like almost sacred phenomena. This was an approach which came close to the much later Romanticist standpoint. But after the Bible translation era, when the Enlightenment thought was spread in the Baltics at the end of the 19th century, 18th century, of course, the situation changed, and the partnership with language was not valid anymore. So the age of Enlightenment brought out a new feature in language policy and ideology, the feeling of dissatisfaction with language. The complaining about the suspected underdevelopment, poverty, roughness, incompleteness, imperfection, defectiveness, and so on of Estonian language. This meant that language and its user were not situated on the same level anymore. Language was not an equal partner any longer, but a tool, a machine, a changeable instrument for achieving one's moral aim. The user of language, the man, stood higher than the language which he had at his disposal. The enlightened man had the right to criticize language, to decide what is good and what is bad in it, to change it, to throw away the elements he disliked, to create new words, morphologies, and syntactic structures he was in need of. The most prominent manifesto of the Enlightenment linguistics on Baltic soil was the article, well published as a separate book, of the professor of Tallinn Gymnasium Friedrich Arvelius, published in 1792, on the culture of Estonian language, über die Kultur der estnischen Sprache. This proclaimed a clear-cut change, a paradigm in understanding language. First, the language of the Bible couldn't be a model of literary language anymore, because it was not in touch with the modern world. Secondly, the usage of an Estonian man couldn't be a model as well, because this man was uneducated, not enlightened. Arvelius wrote, while speaking their language, Estonians let some letters unpronounced. They make use of false cases, and they don't know the right syntax because they have not studied their language properly at school. What is more, Arvelius, following the typology of the most renowned German linguist of the 18th century, Johann Christoph Adelung, says that Estonian sounds bad, really bad, because it has too many gutturals, although I think it doesn't have. Too many long vocals and diphthongs, too few words designating human virtues and higher feelings. So, as you see, the whole background in communicating with language has become rather negative. If the Bible translators kept a neutral attitude towards Estonian, which they wanted to Christianize, then the so-called enlightened intellectuals, feeling themselves to be a higher institution, were quite disdainful of it. Of course, their aims and objectives were at the same time very progressive. They only wanted to do their best to better the nation's moral potential. They believed that the system of language was a mirror of nation's mind. Still more, for them, of molding the mind. Through the restructuring of its language, it was possible to elevate the nation's mentality to the higher ranks of humankind. It was quite typical for the Enlightenment to believe that behind every national language there was an ideal and almost divine conceptual structure, a perfect sign system, each real language being only an imperfect reflection of it. There were no absolutely perfect natural languages, of course, but some of them, the more advanced ones, were closer to the ideal scheme. The primitive language stood far from it. Which were the criteria for it? Semantic transparency, unambiguity, logicality, clearly fixed syntactic structures, rich but not too rich vocabulary, pleasant sound, and so on. Language had to correspond to the rules of reason, but unhappily, this doesn't say much to us. What were actually these rules of reason? Most often the features of the speaker's mother tongue. For example, Aurelius says that an Estonian man speaks against all the rules of reason because he uses the verb to be, sometimes with accusative. Seal oli 3 meest, there were 3 men. Not with nominative, which is the only reasonable way. At the same time, an Estonian uses sometimes nominative when accusative is urgently needed. Pane uks kinni, shut the door. Long vocals and diphthongs are uneconomical. All right, we understand it platonically well, because you waste too much energy while pronouncing the long vocals. But some say precisely, this is the beautiful Estonian. I'm not going to estimate how reasonable were the opinions of this man of the age of reason, quite typical man. In any case, they were not very dangerous because they were too closely opposed to the natural logic of Estonian. It is more important to see which strategies of action resulted from this style of reasoning. Principally, there was the choice between two. First was the renovation of language, or language reform. At the end of his article, Aurelius suggests to create some new Estonian words through derivation. His examples were lahkus, puhtus, rahulikkus, ustavus, and so on. These were in fact good proposals, and we do have the words in Estonian vocabulary up to now. The traditional language renovation is, in its essence, a typically Enlightenment phenomenon. It actually corresponds to the mind of enlightenment, the conscious and active making of language, with the aim of building up the mind. This tradition has been powerful in Estonia afterwards, and you can say that almost every prominent grammarian of the 19th century was a bit of a renovator. The climax was reached at the beginning of the 20th century, as everybody knows, with the language renovation movement directed by Johannes Avik. Some researchers, for example, Antoine Chalvin in France, call Avik a romantic individualist, but I can't agree with it. The essential features of Avik's big linguistic plan were of Enlightenment quality. The other Enlightenment strategy of linguistic behavior in the Baltics was, at first sight, somehow paradoxical. This was the Germanization of Estonians and Latvians, both of them, of course. I suggest that we are too often inclined to think that the men who were ready to turn Estonians into Germans were a sort of bad guys, indifferent to Estonians' attempts to develop themselves as civilized people. Quite the opposite is true. To Germanize was considered one of the Enlightenment strategies in the Baltics. As I said already, in the eyes of the Enlightenment figures, behind every language there was a pure divine linguistic structure, which was reflected in national tongues. In German, it was, of course, better reflected than in Estonian. So they thought this was the universal conviction of the period, because German was, say, analytically more advanced language. So to help Estonians and Latvians to become Germans was a humanist task. Johann Wilhelm Ludwig von Lutze, for example, an Estophile who established the first Estonian language society in 1817 and was convinced of the beauty of Estonian language, tended towards the positive value of Germanization. Karl Lipp Helvig Merkel, a hero of Baltic German counterculture, one can say, who painted the idealist picture of Latvians and Estonians' ancient past in his early masterpieces, spoke later for Germanization as a salvation. And there were several other examples. The most eminent enemies of Germanization, the opposers of it, happened to be conservative landowners who were not interested in breaking the barriers between social classes. So there were indeed some dangers of losing national peculiarity in the Enlightenment ideologies. Humankind, mankind, not nation, was their holy word. The Enlightenment was fond of universal values and willing to amalgamate the little communities into bigger ones. It didn't have trust in natural languages. It worshipped the perfect scheme of science behind them. Yet, the stress it laid on education, cultural advancement, thirst of knowledge, self-improvement, and so on, this cannot be overestimated, of course. If the period of Bible translators saw language to be their partner, approximately on the same level, and if the men of Enlightenment looked arrogantly down on language as a tool of knowledge, then there was the third paradigm to come after Enlightenment, which can be called Romanticist. In this phase, the trust in natural language, which the old pastors more or less did have, was restored, and it even strengthened remarkably. But at the same time, the belief in culture, education, advancement was taken over from the Enlightenment thought. So in Romanticist ideology of language, the old and new beliefs become in some sense mixed. If the leading figure of Enlightenment linguistics in German-speaking lands was Johann Christoph Adelung, then the Romanticist or pre-Romanticist ideas of language were mostly generated by Johann Gottfried Herder, who in his youth had close ties with the Baltics. In the works of Baltics authors with Romanticist tendencies, these two names, Adelung and Herder, as far as they are cited, of course not very often, but as far as they are cited, go mostly hand in hand. The Enlightenment traits in Herder's philosophy cannot be denied, of course. He as well propagated cultural and moral refinement. Still, there was a difference between the two men, a big difference. Adelung was a prophet of rational, intellectual language and disliked its sensual, poetical, dark, subterranean side. Herder, vice versa, was in love with bold poetical metaphors, passionate syntax, archaic power of language. From Johann Georg Hamann, he inherited a vision of an ancient poetical era when language was like music, synthetic, powerful and magical, like in paradise, like in Adam's mouth when Adam gave names to beasts and plants. And Herder believed that in old poetry, in folk songs, and in old language, the remnants of this original divine language can be found. This marked the watershed. The Enlightenment was in front of new future language. Romanticism cultivated its passion for the ancient relics. In addition to that, Herder interpreted the nations as microcosms, which were in some sense perfect in their non-corrupted wholeness, and national languages as the souls of national bodies, as the substances of nations. In this trend of thought, national language, nation's mother tongue, became a kind of holy thing, the container of worldview, both intellectual and emotional, not an instrument anymore. If the Enlightenment looked down on language, then Romanticism looked up to it in admiration. The traces of Herderian view, although very fragmentary, can be followed first of all in the articles by Johann Heinrich Rosenplanter, who was the editor of famous linguistic and folkloric journal Beiträge zur genauen Kenntnis der estnischen Sprache. Nation and language are planted in our bodies, he said. During some 20 years, all the linguistic positions I described just now were represented in his periodical, in the Beiträge. Biblical paternity, Enlightenment distrust and criticism, and Romanticist veneration of language. The last one was represented not only by the editor Rosenplanter himself, but the others as well. For example, Heinrich Georg von Jannau, who composed a long treatise, 1828, with the aim to find out the lost original language of Estonians. What do we have at our disposal today? Such was the opinion of Jannau. These are only fragments, splinters, remain pieces of once big and powerful language. We must try to reconstruct it in order to build it up anew. The Enlightenment man had been proud of himself and his reason. He didn't want to look back for a model. The Romanticist figures tried to find the model in the golden past of a nation. They trusted history in the name of future. To reconstruct in order to build up. This was the new motto which was put into reality in the next generations of Baltic German culture, when among the leading figures were already ethnic Estonians, Friedrich Robert Fehlmann, Friedrich Reinhold Kreutzwald, and others. The result of the efforts was, as we know, the national epic Kalevipoeg, a basis for new national developments. But, as I tried to show, not only a Romanticist enthusiasm, but the Enlightenment criticism and the hard work on the Bible that lasted more than 1 century, they all were needed to gain these results. Thank you. Sorry.